Hey guys, it's Edward. So today, I wanted to go over the Android testing philosophy at Airbnb. I will be referring to their 7-part blog post in this, but granted how long their blog posts are, we probably won't get through all of it, and this video will probably be broken up into multiple chunks. However, I do think that this is a very good blog to visit, even if you're not an Android developer, because no matter what system you're working on, chances are there is a lot of test code that you're going to need to understand, write, and develop, especially when you develop products in the future. And so it's very important to understand where testing comes from and what philosophy each system uses in order to guide their testing principles. For instance, depending on the type of architecture you're dealing with, you might just end up using only QA to test end-to-end interactions, or you might actually also have some type of unit testing or integration testing. And to the extent that you do each one is completely up to the philosophy underneath, which is guiding the architecture. And I'll show you how this all plays together. I'll also link the engineering blog post down below if you want to follow along. If you're not interested in me talking through several blog posts, the long and short of it is that Airbnb tends to actually follow the Android recommended guideline for model view model architecture. However, they add their own caveats, tweaks, twists, and turns in order to help make the testing and architecture scale. And you'll see that a lot of techniques that they use in order to achieve this are actually classified as anti-patterns. So if you like this type of content, please like and subscribe and watch this until the very end. It lets me know you like this and you want to see more content like this. And if you follow me on my socials, you can vote for what topic I cover next. So with that, let's begin. So I'm not going to read the engineering blog post verbatim. I will highlight the parts that I think are relevant, summarize it for you to understand, and give you my commentary and reaction based on it. So let's start with the first blog post, the philosophy and mocking of Android testing. So what Airbnb has done in the past is use manual testing to test end-to-end interactions in order to catch regressions before releasing. However, it seems like only testing with only QA does not actually scale. So they've tried some automated UI testing like with Espresso. However, they found quite a number of issues with it. And the complication and inability to use Espresso came from, I would say, 3 factors. The first one is just the flakiness of tests in general. Now, test flakiness is a pretty important part of testing because if your tests are flaky, then your developers are just going to ignore it. And then what's the point of having the test to begin with? You know, sometimes the test will pass, sometimes the test won't pass. So how do you know which signals that you should listen to and which signals you should ignore? The second one is that they have a monolithic code structure, that their fragments and UI code are all together. Consider fragments to be portions of a screen or some interaction that compacts together the UI and business logic. And what they're saying is that a lot of the UI and business logic were just put into one God class. So being able to test either the UI or business logic independently was absolutely not viable. And the third one is maintaining their HTTP requests. Now, why would you want to do this? Because you don't want to necessarily test against server or production because those values are always changing. You want to test against some deterministic server response in order to get a deterministic output from your test. So it makes sense to keep these server responses as a hard copy in your repo. And this apparently worked for them for years until the number of contributors ended up reaching probably in like the hundreds, I would say. And after that, things just got way out of hand and there was a need to rethink how they did testing. How they did testing before with just QA is very much like a well-funded startup. And I think a lot of people, before they get into FANG, are more exposed to this kind of testing. And so what we're seeing here from Airbnb is this transition from a startup company to a more well-rounded, bigger tech company that can scale their numerous products. So the first things first is to be able to identify what kind of architecture that should formally be adopted. Do you remember what I said about these fragments, how they were essentially God classes that contained UI and business logic together? The question is how to separate these. And there are a lot of different flavors that you can do. You can do model view controller, model view presenter, or model view model. And like I said in the beginning, it looks like Android Jetpack view model was a very good fit and was very popular with the Android community. And it looks like Airbnb decided to adopt this. Specifically, what I'm referring to here is the fact that Google does keep tabs on the Android community, what bugs are frequently encountered, and constantly releases new tools and technologies in order to try and combat all of these. One of them was a lack of official architecture for the Android ecosystem. And so Android Jetpack View Model is something that is officially recommended by Google, and Airbnb wants to build on that. What is this MVRX library? It looks like MVRX is just a way of handling states in a lifecycle aware manner. So what I mean by this is that when your mobile phone decides to rotate from horizontal to vertical orientation or power on and off and sleep at screen, a lot of things are going on underneath the hood in order to try and save battery life. For instance, because your screen is not showing any activities or any app, what the system will try to do is essentially shut down as many of the components as it can in order to save your battery, and then we'll spin them back up when it comes time to reuse it again. And so this library was really built around trying to manage these states properly without having the developers tweak this constantly. So let's actually look at what the code is to generate a simple screen. So you have your view model here that's responsible for holding the business logic. You have here some kind of state that is responsible for holding some kind of values. And then you have the fragment itself, which extends from the MVRX fragment. The MVRX fragment will house the view model and an epoxy controller. If you don't know what epoxy is, don't worry about it. Epoxy is just syntactic sugar for being able to write some UI components in a very clean way without worrying about a lot of boilerplate. But it's nice to know that it doesn't explicitly depend on epoxy and can be used elsewhere, which is actually quite nice. For instance, Android Compose recently just came out, and that is another way of handling UI rendering with syntactic sugar. So if you choose to use that, then it's great that this library actually provides you the flexibility to do so. So what are the benefits of arranging something like this? Well, this state object that we saw here, what's great is that you can take this state, isolate it, and just test the input and output values as if it was just a normal piece of code without ever having to hook it up to the Android UI. And you use this state in order to drive values and occurrences on the UI. So for instance, let's suppose I had this Android screen here, right? I see chat, simple, mobile chat, and notes. So this image up here could be an HTTP URL to a JPEG. And then here, this chat could be a piece of text. And then this subtitle here would be another piece of text. This email, password, register button color, this register text itself, and so on and so forth. All these individual components are actually driven by the state. The UI is rebuilt every single time the state changes and is purely based on state. So that's actually kind of interesting because this implies that even if the state is a composite of smaller states, any one of the smaller state changes, the entire UI has to re-render, which actually makes it sound kind of expensive. The reason why gaming takes up so much more power is because the screen is constantly refreshing with new data, new images, new objects. And this is akin to what is happening here, is that it's refreshing so much and changing so many times, or at least potentially can, that you just might end up trading battery life in exchange for ease of development. I'd like to see Airbnb's metrics on how well their app handles battery, actually. Now, what do they hope to accomplish by doing this? Well, tests should be stable with no flakiness. In order for us to respect these tests, they have to be deterministic and able to produce results that we can respect and listen to. It should easily add tests to a screen, and updating tests should be simple. This makes sense, because when your products are constantly changing, you're going to want to be able to add newer tests very, very quickly. Especially when you have new screens or new products that you want to ship, you want to add these tests very quickly without having to write and tinker with every single little possibility or bug that might come up. Running fast on CI means that they intend to have these tests be a part of their diffs and their merge requests, which is pretty standard procedure. The question is, how does that pipeline actually work? And can these tests run fast enough so that way developers know that their diff is ready to land within, let's say, an hour of committing? Now, these all sound great, you know? I think these are pretty par for the course for a lot of testing frameworks, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. So for instance, you might end up trading a little bit of flakiness in exchange for ease of development. So let's see how closely they follow this. What I think is really interesting is that despite how flaky their experiences has been with Espresso, they still want to improve on it. I mean, it's better to improve upon something that is out in the wild than it is to just try and develop something from the ground up. So now they talk about mocking. Mocking here is the idea that you can replace one component with a dummy component interchangeably without breaking everything else. In this specific case, what they're talking about is being able to mock any view model and attach it to a fragment of their choosing. As an example, let's actually look at what they provided here. Obviously, this list of dad jokes is not meant for production, but is used in lieu of something that could come back from the server. So this could be a list of messages between you and a host. Except now that what they did was they mocked the view model that was supposed to just retrieve the message between you and the host and replaced it with this list of dad jokes. So let's actually see what this looks like in code. You start off with your MVRX fragment, and then you have your view model that is provided by this fragment view model. And so in order to have mocks, they actually specifically create a provide mocks implementation that you override. So why would they do this? The reason why they do this is because this mock state forces them to have static deterministic states and values. It would be very awkward to mock a data model if it had to deal with asynchronous requests, having to tie them back up, composite multiple asynchronous requests, and then send it back. Because at that point, you're testing your composition logic to sew back together these different asynchronous pieces, and you're also testing whether or not your fragment can actually render it. It's better to keep things very simple and to keep the information static. And they actually define these states in a separate file in order to be able to manage it. Once you have that file in that state, then you just override it with all these values that you want. But I think what's even more interesting is actually this part, how they actually generate these states. But suppose let's say you had the Airbnb main screen. You see all these complicated lists, some of them horizontally swiping, some of them like have different graphics, and probably correspond to different ideas or in different places. So the question is, how do you mock states like these? Well, it turns out they actually have a command that allows you to take the state of each one of these view models, and record them. And then from there, you actually are able to generate the code for it. I think that's really useful because you can actually take what is currently in production, convert it into a mock state automatically for any developer, so that way they don't have to write it manually. So let's talk about mock variants specifically when it comes to the state. What is it saying here? How do we take a default state that the repo might have given us and then add our own twist to it as a developer? We're guaranteed that the state in the repo is up to date with whatever specs that product or platform have designed for us. How do we essentially override it for ourselves? And so what they ended up doing was actually create a DSL or domain-specific language in order to auto-generate a lot of the overridden states. Why is there a need to create a domain-specific language? Why not just use what Kotlin provides in order to create a mock? You could just create a default state and then override it in a class and then override the values that you want. And that's the thing, it might work, but it also looks really, really complicated and gross. Imagine just trying to create a whole new data class file just so that you can override a default class, just to test one variant of a state. And that's essentially what's happening here on this first line, is that you have a lot of nested copying here, whereas what they're trying to do is make this read a little bit more like an English sentence, where you can see that they set the request where the success state is the results, and then with empty list as the empty state. This looks a little bit easier to read. What they're doing is trying to get rid of all these extraneous copy words that don't add any value to the syntax or the language that you're writing in. The trade-off for this syntactic sugar is actually reflection. And for those who don't know, reflection is just trying to specify a method that may or may not exist in a class by saying, hey, I'm looking for a constructor that takes these parameters, or I'm looking for a method by this name. Now, does this work? Yeah. The reason why this is an anti-pattern is because it ignores the package permissions that you've set. Those private, public, and default permissions? Reflection overrides that, because it just checks to see if the function or the constructor or whatever that you specify just exists. But for now, think of it as a hacky way of accessing variables that you want. Now, to wrap this up, I want to talk about this mock launcher. What they're saying here is that a lot of the screens take a lot of hoops to jump through in order to get to. For instance, if you want to test the checkout page, you have to add a booking, you have to set all these variables like the number of nights you're staying, and you have to jump through all these different screens just to get to the final screen. Imagine having to jump through 5 to 10 screens just so you can test one little text change. And so this mock launcher provides a shortcut into any particular screen that a developer wants. And I think this is actually quite useful. I think a lot of companies and a lot of debug builds will actually have this, where you can actually jump straight to the screen that you want with whatever mock data that you want. And so that wraps up this introduction to Airbnb's testing. Hopefully you guys learned something a little bit about Android development, the nature of testing, and what to look out for. In the next one, we'll talk about how they integrate snapshot testing into their workflow and their merge requests. So that'll do for me. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Also, feel free to connect with me on my socials, where you can vote for what topic I cover next. And if you're looking to secure that next job offer, you can book me for interview coaching at eChanTech.com. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.